All right, I've lied twice now. Apparently, this is the last two videos were not going to be the last ones. Uh, Basically, as I've been working with it, I've been kind of coming up with some small things that I would like to add in addition, as well as kind of extend upon. So, anyways, what we're going to end up doing in this one is now that we have kind of our inputs and everything set up. So, for reference, here I am playing as a client. So, let me go ahead and jump. So, I activated the ability. It is not ended. When I press when I release, you can see on input released. That will fire. However, our input pressed will not fire. We want the input pressed to fire even if the ability is active. And that's just a simple logic problem because currently we have it set up for ability input pressed. It will only fire if the ability is inactive. So it activates the ability first and then it tries to press it or fire off the pressed event. That's a little bit of a problem because we want to have things potentially such as constantly running abilities that are solely handled through these inputs. So that's some areas where we want to focus on. We want to do that, and we also want to touch on the replicate input directly. So this by default uses the gameplay abilities, kind of like, I guess you could say, the default input handling, which is through kind of like a form of an input ID basically. And we want to put this functionality back in so that way we have the option, at least. I don't really recommend it in most cases, but when you press the input, we also want it to fire server side. It's likewise when we release the input, we also want it to fire server side, only if this is checked. So let's go ahead and implement the first fix. That's going to be if the ability spec is active. So here's where we kind of want to make the change. So we're going to go ahead and copy that or cut that code. And we're going to first off check and see, okay, is this the ability we want? So once we confirm that, here's where we can do our check. So if the ability spec is not active, what we will do is we will try to activate the ability. And then afterwards, regardless, we will fire off the pressed event. So the result for this is going to be, even though the ability is active, our on input pressed can still occur. And examples of use case for this would be something like, let's say you had CSGO and you pick up a bomb. Well, if you picked up a bomb, you now have the ability to plant the bomb. So you might want to always have this ability running and checking to see if you're at a valid point to start planting. And at that point, you would basically rely on your input pressed and released as to whether or not to plant and cancel planting the bomb. So now that that is rebuilt, let's go ahead and hit play again as a client. So I'm going to go ahead and jump really quick. And when I press space, on input pressed, released, pressed, released. So as you can see, they now fire. And that's what we wanted. Next up, we want to set up this replicate input directly. So when this is true, we want these to fire server side as well. So this is also something that's relatively simple to do. So here we can go ahead and just enable it, just so I'm going to probably end up forgetting to and then wonder why it's not working. And this is very simple to actually do. So what we want to do is if we grab our ability spec and we grab the ability, we can search for the replicate input directly. And based upon if that is true or false, we call a corresponding RPC. So if the ability is set to replicate input directly, we want to call server set input pressed. And as you can see, whoops, move my mouse, that takes in a F gameplay ability spec handle, which we have right here. So we can just grab our ability spec.handle and pass it in. So we're going to copy this and move down to our ability input released and pass that in as well. And instead of calling server set input pressed, we're going to call server set input released. Now again, we can go ahead and rebuild. And what this should do is when this is enabled, these should fire server side as well. So we should get two prints, one on the client and one on the server. So we're going to jump, wait for the logs to go away, and just so it's easier to read, now we're going to hold it. We have client input pressed and server input pressed. And when I release, we have client input released and server input released printing. So these are now firing on both the client and the server. And if we uncheck it, let's confirm that it does in fact not print, even though it shouldn't. So we'll go ahead and fire off the events. So we'll press it, and now only the client is actually firing off the events. And that's what we want. So that way we can do various things, such as, let's say you wanted to not really have any logic run, you can just do a traditional has authority. And if you have authority, then only the server in this case is going to actually run the inputs, assuming you wanted that for, whatever reason. So now you can see only the server fires on input pressed and on input released. Well, it doesn't only fire those. These run client side too, but the authority check doesn't have it run, locally. Anyways, that is going to be all for this video, and I would potentially be lying if I said this was the last one. I do not know. Actually, I do know this is not going to be the last one, because I do want to also have a default set up here for passive abilities. And the passive abilities are basically going to be the exact same thing as the starting abilities, but they're going to be, instead of just added, where I'm at, instead of just, added or / given, whatever you want to call it, they're going to be given and activated automatically. So that's going to be something else we set up in probably the next video. So I'll see you then.